from the time that I started, which was 10 years ago now. I started working in visual effects in games right around the era when the industry was taking the jump from PS2 up to PS3. And what was happening at that time is the processor of the PS3 was powerful enough that all of a sudden effects could actually be somewhat prioritized. So in the industry right before I joined, what was happening is effects were an afterthought. They were something that the environment artists did just to add a tiny little bit of flavor to the game if they had time. There was nobody that was specializing full-time in particle effects. And it was really, really low priority because the processor couldn't handle enough to make it worth the cost. With the PS3 came this really sort of turn for us where all of a sudden you actually have a powerful enough processor and graphics processor that you can focus on priorities and you can you can focus on particles and you can start to use them to help further develop the game experience, whether it's the narrative, the design, whatever. Like it was a viable tool to help build impact for the game. So when I started in the industry, there was really nobody at the time that was focusing in special effects. The other effects artists that were dubbed effects artists were people that had been doing them as environment artists that were just interested in effects. And so there was this really cool opportunity for me to move in and be a full-time effects artist, which everybody in the industry was looking for, and sort of help push and grow the foundation of those tools. So at that time, the effects were really, really, really simple still. You're basically just using non-intelligent squares floating in the air to try to sell a different type of effect. Over the course of the lifespan of the PS3, we started dabbling in better shaders and ways to add cool motion to the particles using math, using pre-rendered sequences. Better ways to integrate them, which would be like the lighting and the heuristics that spawn them. Better ways to tie them to actual gameplay so that like can the player cause reactions in the environment. I used the example in the discussion we had earlier of like if I walk into an old sawmill or something, the character should be kicking up dust. And so we wanted to start exploring the art of using effects to help sell something. Can an effect actually tell a story? And to me, that's kind of the beauty of effects, is that everything that you're doing with effects can actually sell the story of the world to the player if it's done right. And so we were starting to sort of adapt that art form. By the end of the PS3's era, I think we were maxing what the console was able to do, and we were getting some pretty cool results with it. Now that we're on the PS4, obviously our entire limitations have jumped again, so we had to step back and reconsider what it was exactly that we were limiting ourselves by and how we want to push it. Everyone immediately jumped to volumetrics, and we're not there yet. There's no good volumetric systems that work on the PS4 or any of the modern current consoles, basically, that work well enough. There's a couple companies trying it, and we're all waiting to see how they do. But I always use the example of we're about 10 years behind what film is doing. And about 10 years ago in film, they were just doing really, really smart shaders and really smart integration into the scenes. They were doing a lot of compositing tricks and being really intelligent about their production pipeline and how they can exploit that in the effects. And that's something that we as effects artists for games are just now finally getting to the point that we can start to do. So there's a lot of advancements in the types of shaders you're using, the really cool things you can do in shaders, exploiting the compositing pipeline of your game engine effectively. And that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of the tech and potential technique growth in the industry right now. What I'm hoping for is that we're all, as artists, going to continue pushing the medium to the point of using it to achieve a new type of feel. So again, telling a story with your effects, not just there's a fire here, but actually showing that fire grow, showing the explosion not only have a bursting impact, but also have the smoke sit there and drift away slowly with a breeze and actually have it implied in the way the wind pattern is running through the environment and show the damage long after the explosion's gone. So sort of more of the integration is kind of our catchphrase of the day into the environment, into the world. So that's kind of, I guess, the progression of what effects in games has been. And to me, like, we're finally crossing the point where effects can lend itself to be an artistic medium. In the last like 2 or 3 years, I do feel like we're finally getting to the point where our tech allows us to be artists again. And so I'm really, really excited just about the next couple of years to see what people are able to pull off with it.
Cool. Now, so for those of people that are maybe not versed on effects,
Yeah.
what would you say are the types of effects that you would do, for any kind of production?
Sure. Can I actually can we turn up the lights for the room really quick? I just want to just get a show of hands here. Like, how many people are interested in effects? How many people have ever worked with effects? Let me ask that.
I can see some.
Okay, so a portion of you. Good. That's actually more than I expected. Cool. So the way that I usually break down effects is, on the very broad scope, the effects department of most game companies, and you vary this depending on where you go, are in charge of adding motion to everything that's not a character or a vehicle. So that could be the actual simulation of the building cracking and destructing and blowing away. That could be the flags whipping around. That could be the leaves blowing. That's also the dust, the explosions, the rain, the blood, the fire, the impact effects, basically everything in the world that's not moving, that's not a character. Sometimes we've actually had to help out with different solutions to even get things moving, like in Uncharted 3 during the skydiving sequence, we wanted to add a concept of wind flapping on Drake's clothes, and so we had to set up some vertex shaders, and that was a little bit cross-disciplinary, but the point being that we're always trying to think of ways to add motion and life to what a game actually is, which is a static, 3D, lifeless, soulless level. Now, the actual tasks that we have kind of break down into 3 major categories for me because depending on which category they're in, the focus changes. And so I always describe effects with my team as either ambient effects, ambient or narrative effects, design effects, or feedback effects. And what I mean by those, if we just take the first category, the ambient effects would be the things that do add subtle detail to the world. They bring the world to life. And usually what you want those to do is, like, the most important focus of those types of effects is to sit well in the environment. They need to be composited and integrated correctly into the environment. They need to be subtle so that when the player is walking through your level, they're not distracted by your effects, but they're pleasantly influenced by them. So the detail is there if they happen to look, but the designers are still able to keep guiding the player through in their own experience. Those become really important when you are describing a narrative because the tone of the entire level is supposed to match the tone described by the narrative. And so, you run into some variances there. But the focus of those is integration and art. When you get over to the design effects, that usually flips, where a design effect is all about language presented to the player. So if a designer comes to me and says, we'll take a spell. If I ask you guys what color is a healing spell, most of you guys are probably going to say green, right? We have these sort of pre-faceted languages that we expect now, but that's a design effect where it doesn't really matter what the effect I make is as long as it's green, as long as it's presenting to the player that this is a healing spell or a defensive spell. Or if you take an explosion, there's always a blast radius where if you're standing inside the blast radius, you take damage. No matter what my art looks like, no matter how badass or simple the explosion that I make is, if it doesn't present that radius correctly, it's a bad effect. So the number one priority of my effects when I'm authoring for design effects is that it correctly portrays the information that the designers need. The art is secondary, basically. The third category is feedback effects. These would be the bullet hits, the blood impacts, the explosions again. Obviously, they can be in multiple categories here, but with impact effects, what actually matters the most is how it feels. And usually if I make an effect and I just stick it on the ground or in a black box and I make it look good, and then I'm super happy with it, when I go and I hook it up to, let's say, a bullet hit, so when you shoot something, it's going to be really not satisfying because there's no pop. Whereas what we actually want when we're playing a game is we want to feel the immediate consequence of our action as a player. And so I tend to have to bias my effects to have a lot of really hard pop if they're going to be used for that sense of impact. So the goal of the impact effects is to give, or the feedback effects rather, is to give the consequence of player actions, whatever that may be. There's all kinds of different types. But you tend to have to author your art around that concept as well, and that then becomes the hierarchy of goals, that like giving that feedback and making it feel good is the most important, regardless of what it looks like.
Very cool. So you mentioned before about how there was a time where environment artists did some effects. I was wondering if you saw any level of that anymore, where they might do something that's, kind of a simple ambient effect.
That depends entirely on the production team.
Yeah.
When I was at Naughty Dog, we actually kind of stomped that out because I wanted explicit control. Like I've run to a couple different companies now where I'm freelancing lately, and I'll go to the company and the effects artist will just make a fire and then give it to the designers, give it to the environment artists, and they'll go through and place it. But then what happens is you've very clearly got a template fire that's not that's just like stuck in random places. Whereas what I preferred to do at Naughty Dog is I didn't want them placing things because each of those fires should really be shaped around the environment. And there's a couple ways to help make that a little bit more automated, but most of that is just manual labor, where I'm going to go through, and if the fire is going to be curling up this desk, that should be a different fire because the fuel source is completely different, as opposed to a fire that's in the middle of the floor here. Like, those are different effects. It's different art, and it's that attention to detail that I think really pushes the craft a lot more. So typically when I hear about developments where the effects artist is not the one placing the effects, I just right off the bat assume that the effects don't look good.
Let me talk to you also about VR. So VR, I know, is something that you have been kind of working with as of late, and given all of the challenges that you have had to overcome and deal with just in the 2D space, what kind of problems or creative solutions do you come along when you have to deal with it in 3D space?
Yeah, VR has been a fun one because it's brought up a lot of challenges that I think none of us really expected. To step back, I always describe my job as like I'm a shitty street magician, where every task that I do is a new trick, basically, and it really only works with the expectations around your viewer perspective. I can sit here and I can do some sweet magic tricks that from this perspective right here are going to blow you away, but the moment you can walk around me, that entire illusion is gone, and the moment you see my trick, everything that I was doing is no longer magical and amazing. You see exactly what I'm doing, you see past it. VR is essentially giving the viewers the ability to immediately see everything that I'm doing on most of my techniques. So there's a lot of things. I used the example earlier of a fog bank. Typically in 2D, what I would do for a big fog bank is I would lay down like one or two huge cards with a really nice swirling material on them, and then I would use some fancy math to make it blend in depth. But it would just be two giant quads floating in the world. And in 2D, that works great. It totally sells the illusion of fog until the player really needs to interact with it. But if at a distance, it sells it. In VR, that's gone. Like, you can immediately see that it's just a giant quad. And so what we have to do is find other solutions for that. That comes with the different challenge, though, in that VR, I'm not rendering one screen at 30 frames a second. I'm rendering two screens at 90 frames a second. So my GPU buffer, like the amount of particles that I can put on screen at one time, is way, way tighter. Like, my budget is super restricted. So my normal solution, like the very first thought that I would have for that fog bank challenge is I'm just going to add a whole lot more particles. And they'll be smaller chunks, and they'll blend together, basically. They'll work with them so that it feels like it's got some depth to it. But because of the GPU limitations, I can't. So there's not actually a really clean, great solution for that. What a lot of people are starting to do is try using actual primitive shapes. So instead of just being based on a single plane, why don't we try using spheres? Why don't we try using other shapes that are a little bit more complex to help us with that concept of depth that VR gives you? And it helps. You have other issues, but like all these different things bring up different types of math. So depth blending on a sphere gives you all kinds of different opportunities because it's no longer just a plane. So what more can we do to exploit that? VR for us right now is just kind of a wild frontier where everyone's trying different things and everyone's succeeding and failing in different ways. So it's been really cool over the past year or so just to watch all the different tech talks and stuff that are coming out and see what people are doing.
Right. So let's dive into the storytelling a little bit aspect of effects, because I think, like you were saying, there was a time where they were just in there, or they're, just based off of need. But we're starting to see some things where they're having real implications to kind of setting the mood for a scene. Mm-hmm. Can you give me some examples of some things that you've worked on that kind of fall in that realm, and maybe some things that you'd like to see? Yeah,
I mean, I think, I suppose like every artist, there's way more that I could have done and wish I'd done and would like to do in the future. But if we take the effects goals from the Uncharted games, the game was very saturated, very cinematic, very high intensity, a very summer blockbuster. And so most of our time and effort was really spent on those blockbuster moments and just building tech and trying to find cool ways to make all that function and work. Once we got to The Last of Us, that all completely changed, where right off the bat we were actually, because internally we wanted the games to differentiate themselves tremendously, and so we had these basic rules for ourselves in development, and one of the rules was no set pieces. Obviously we were going to do interesting things, but like we had this concept on Uncharted of the game is pieced together by these massive set pieces of excitement and Hollywood blockbuster. And all that was gone because we wanted a really slow, delicate, and consequential pacing to The Last of Us. So For the effects, what that meant is that our focus became entirely about subtlety. And once we started learning more about the story and sort of seeing where the story was going, we saw that weather was extremely important to the mood. Basically, like the sky and the weather and the lighting of the entire environment always matches the intended tone of what's supposed to be happening in the story at that time. And it was just this really, really well thought out concept that we were trying to associate all of the art with the intent and tone of the emotion that we're trying to convey to the player at the time. So you've got the dark, rainy city sequences that are really cold, cool color temperature, but also we're trying to make it feel really lonely. And so we used a lot of rain, and we tried to just make the place feel very desolate and wild and empty, but not lifeless. So we had to use and lean on the rain effects quite a bit to actually make it feel like there was still a lot going on. Then once we get over to like the Wild Animal Kingdom, where it's a happy beat in the game, it's this like bright, saturated, one of the main characters kind of gets to go back to her childhood innocence, and so we wanted to just convey like that feeling of when you're in a park. You know, like those really nice days when you just take the time out and you go sit down on a grassy hill in a park, and you have a breeze, and it's bright and colorful, there's some leaves floating around, some butterflies, and it just feels kind of happy. So we're trying to find different effects that kind of fit into all those different tones and how we can use them. One of the other things that we really started pushing ourselves on towards the end of The Last of Us was this concept of, can the effects themselves tell a story? In real life, every environment, everything that we touch, every surface that we touch tells us a story of some kind. Environment artists, good environment artists, have been taking this concept for a really long time, where like if I look at this table, I can tell at some point it was dragged on its side right here, both vertically because of the scratches and sideways because of the scratches. I can roughly tell where people have been putting their hands more and like rubbing the edges more. Right here's got a bunch of notches. Like these are all the history of this particular object. That's a boring example, but every environment should be telling those types of stories where you can look at it and tell where people have walked, where people have abused it, and what's been happening in this. Effects are also an equal opportunity to do that, where there's a breeze floating through every single room, so why isn't the smoke moving according to the breeze in the vents? If there's dust in the room, why isn't it getting kicked up more when that breeze gets manipulated? If we're talking about an explosion, traditionally in effects, we've had to have this technique of you get the burst because it's a feedback effect. You get the burst, and so we would focus primarily on the burst, but then once it's smoky, it's overdraw at that point, and it's not important because it's a feedback effect, so we'd fade it out. But now we have a better processor, so we have the opportunity to actually make the smoke do something and sit into the world and feel better. And so we're trying to push a lot of effects that actually like focus not so much on the burst. Still, it needs to feel good, but why can't that smoke sit around and linger for a few minutes and like slowly evaporate and fade away, so that you can come up to this level or to this area and know like, oh, that explosion happened over there a few minutes ago. That's still cool. It's floating off and drifting away. Like, we want the effects to really tell the story, not only of the environment, but also of the player interaction in the environment. You know, I described earlier that we want the effects to be the consequence of the player. Well, how cool would it be if those consequences actually lingered? We spent a lot of time in The Last of Us focusing on like handprints and bloody handprints in one particular level, and it wasn't very procedural. It was fairly scripted sequence, but we loved the idea of like, how awesome is that? Like his hand got bloody, and then obviously he's going around touching his hand everywhere. How cool would it be if you could leave handprints just automatically throughout the world? Because the hand placement system is there. Why can't we do that? And then if you happen to backtrack, you would still be able to see your handprint there and like know that you caused that as a player. And that's kind of tying everything together into this world and sucking the player more into the game experience is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve. But there's all kinds of cool ways we can do this. The other, I suppose, area that I want to beat in on a little bit more is I'm a big fan of the statement that the effect should tell the full story of its life and death. And that's kind of new. Like, again, a lot of the concepts that we were using in the past generation was just get the important part of the effect out and call it good. But now we have the opportunity, and we should take the opportunity to try to tell that full story of the effect. So fire is a classic example of you know, what is the fire coming from? So maybe, I don't know, maybe the leg of this table somehow, it's metal, but let's say it's wood, catches fire. Why can't I actually show that progression of fire up the leg and across the table and tell that story of the table actually burning over the course of it? It might have some gameplay implications, but that actually applies to so many different things as well. Like, again, the explosion and the smoke. There's a demo of a forest fire that was beautifully done in Unreal a couple months ago. And it looked fantastic as a still shot, but if you watched it for 3 seconds, you saw that every second is the same for as long as you watch it. Like, there was no progression. And it kind of killed me because it was this really stunningly composed scene that did nothing. And it ended up being really boring. Whereas if he actually found a way to have progression, like even just a breeze, let's say the fire doesn't change fuel sources, but even just a breeze that comes in and whips it around and just adds a little bit of variety. If you ever happen to look in a game and you see the classic bonfire effect, if you pay attention to it and actually think through what an actual bonfire does, there's so much variety, and every slight change in breeze and atmospheric pressure is going to completely change that. You're going to get pops where the fuel pops and a bunch of embers come up. Most game effects will never do any of that. It's going to be the same 3-4 second cycle, basically just looping over and over again. And we've accepted that because that was roughly what we could do at the time, but that's no longer true. We can do so much more, and I want to see a lot more people taking advantage of that. And a lot of that has to come in our tools as well. That's, I guess, another conversation we could dig into. But
yeah. Let me ask you about source. So where do you find sort of source or inspiration for producing effects? I mean, obviously you could just go, well, I'm just going to look at a fire, and that's to one extent. But I mean, are there any other places that you might think of, or how do you approach it?
Reference is a tricky one for us because there's still so much we just can't do. So I tend to do a hierarchy of reference. Where the very first thing that I'm always going to do is I'm going to go look at nature. If I can make a fire, I'll make a fire. If I can't, I'll YouTube. Mythbusters is amazing. Like anything that I can see that what would happen in real life. And so I'll look at that and I'll see what I can discern and what I'm going to possibly be able to recreate. The second thing I'll do is what would happen in a Hollywood movie, because there's oftentimes actually quite a bit of dissonance between the two. But what people expect is Hollywood, not reality. So cars don't blow up. If you shoot snow, there's not a 6-foot geyser of snow. Like those things you expect as a consumer because that's what Hollywood is. Like that's what's defined the action genre. So I need to do that, not reality. But I still want to always have it hewn towards reality. And then the third thing I'm going to do is look at what my competition has done. And I do that because it sets my benchmark. I can certainly strive for Hollywood, but I'm probably never going to get there. My tools suck compared to theirs. My potential is really limited because I'm real time. So what my minimum bar is I have to do it at least better than my competition. What I also like about that, is I get to look and analyze their work and figure out what they did well, figure out what they did poorly, and try to learn from it. And because the industry is actually fairly open, more often than not, I can just email them and say, like, hey, I really like that waterfall you guys made. What did you do to solve this challenge? It looked great, and I'll usually get an email back. And then all of a sudden, I've got a friend at this very studio. So most studios are extremely open with sharing techniques and stuff like that. So
very cool. Tell me, so I know this story, but they probably don't. When you guys were prepping for Uncharted 3 and how you were going to handle all of the sand, you took a trip out to the desert, right? To get source, essentially.
Yeah, so we knew our big thing internally, we had snow in Uncharted 2, and then Uncharted 3, we wanted Drake to end up lost in the desert. That was kind of a core idea that we had in the beginning of the game. And a lot of our early art tests looked really bad. Most of the people at Naughty Dog had never been in a desert, never seen dunes in real life, and so we're looking at photos and stuff, and it's not really that well conveyed. And so we kept trying just these quick art tests, and not just effects, but like everyone in art. We couldn't nail the lighting, we couldn't nail the environment modeling, we couldn't nail the texturing, certainly couldn't figure out what the effects were doing. And so we finally said, you know what, screw it, let's go to the desert. So we went out to the Imperial Dunes, which is like a 6-hour road trip away, and got out there, and I guess there's loads of fun stories in there, but got out there, and the very first thing we realized was these massive, like 40-foot dunes of just really soft sand, and sand in that environment actually looks and moves like liquid. Like the desert itself on a really hot day feels stagnant. The air is just like you're in an oven and there's no breeze. But if you look down, there's actually so much motion on the ground of sand just barely moving around and stuff. And it ends up feeling really soft and, again, liquidy, like mercury running down and stuff. A lot of the motion that we were seeing was actually from our interactions in it. And so right off the bat, we were sitting there like, okay, we need to find a way to make it so that our character is causing the life in this environment. The danger that we were running into in our art test is that it just looks static. It looks fake because it is fake. And so we're trying to find ways that we can actually give it a sense of life. And unfortunately, the best way we could do it was through the consequences of Drake. So that became really, really important to us. The other big thing is we were struggling a lot with noise, with contrast, essentially, where if you paint and texture every single grain of sand, you're going to end up with the worst moire pattern in the world in CG. And so we spent a lot of time trying to find ways to keep it feeling soft and working a lot with Fresnels and subsurface scatter, like everything we could possibly think of in our shaders to make it so that when you looked up close, you could see the grain, but as you're walking around through the world, it ends up feeling very soft, which is exactly what was happening in real life. We also had to develop a whole bunch of cool ways to make the sand and the breeze flow along dunes and things like that, but that was the key thing. So we just spent an entire day just like running around, running up and down dunes and tossing ourselves down them and just seeing how the sand works and flows, recorded hours and hours of video and had a blast.
Very cool.
I got heat stroke.
Yeah, right. That was I remember that part. So, like we were talking about before, when again talked about how there's a time where effects didn't have as much importance and they're growing. Are you finding that we're moving from the sort of single effects artists at the company, even these big two, where they're starting to give it enough importance to go, we've got a team, and they're going to handle all kinds of different pieces?
Yeah, the companies that want to prioritize their effects, one of the very first things, I'm doing a lot of consulting and freelancing again, and so I've been pulled into a few different studios where they've only got one effects artist, and they sit me down and they say, okay, we want to have the effects look like The Last of Us. Can you help us? And the very first thing I'm going to have to say is, he needs help. Like it's not a one-man job anymore, because that attention to detail of having to go in and shape every single fire around every single object that the fire's on, like that's work. By the time we shipped The Last of Us, there were, it's been long enough, I need to count. Okay, so we had myself, Eben, Icky, Mike Dudley, Doug, and then we had a contractor. So 7 people. Right. We made, I think it was something like 1,600 effects. Unique effects. I mean, unique, there are a lot of duplicating and like tweaks and things, but it's still unique individual assets that somebody had to sit down and pay attention to. So it's not a small amount of work. Like it was the 7 of us covered every single effect across the entire game. By comparison with Uncharted 2, it was 2 of us, and we started a year late. So we only had a year and a half with no tools, so we had to spend half of that time actually building our particle engine to be able to make effects. So in reality, I'd say we made the entire game, 2 people, in 7 months, 8 months. It's totally different, and it's growing. I mean, every development in general is getting much bigger as companies are trying to pay that attention to detail. Running straight towards the uncanny valley, and the only thing that's really preventing people from hitting it is that attention to detail.
Very cool. Let's talk about tools, because we brought it up before.
Yeah.
I guess, what kind of tools do you use? What's available for, if there's somebody that wants to get into it and maybe doesn't have access to proprietary tools, what's a good path for them?
Right. Oh, there's so much to say about that. So I suppose tools. Over the course of that history leading up to right now, effects tools have been so scattered where every single studio had their own solutions to effects. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. And there were no standards. It's funny, I would have a hard time actually communicating with other effects artists from other companies, because particle system or emitter would mean something totally different to them to what it would mean for me. The standardization of Unreal 4 being free, you guys learning Unreal, and just like the easy access to Unreal has kind of meant that we're all using Unreal as our standard. So it's kind of cool. We're actually starting to see that all the tools are kind of converging and moving in one general direction, which is great. So the industry's kind of progressing together. So the baseline of what I would say is even though like Naughty Dog has their own proprietary tools, if you know how to use Unreal's tools to a great effect, you're going to be able to go in and pick up what we were doing at Naughty Dog. The tools at Naughty Dog were way more advanced because we focused so much on integration, and because we had our own programmer sitting next to us dedicated to helping us come up with different solutions. So we could kind of do whatever I wanted. If I went in one day and said, hey, I want this crazy thing, if my programmer agreed to it and said, okay, that's the best way to cover this, then we'd have it in a couple days.
That's good to have.
Yeah. It's a huge deal breaker.
Yeah.
but so the point being that Unreal is a great asset for us to use as a standard. It's great for you guys just to sit down and learn and show me that you can make art in Unreal, and then I'm going to use that as a benchmark basically to say, okay, if you can do it there, I can help you do it here. Other tools, though, to use, like that's just the core engine. That's where my particles are actually simulating it real time. Other tools to use, whatever works. We literally use everything in the book. I pull textures from Substance, from Google, from Photoshop. Obviously, Photoshop's still the main painting. I simulate in anything. I've even used like particle illusion and all kinds of old school tools. Houdini and Fume are huge right now. Fume is very fast for doing those types of effects. Houdini is just like remarkably powerful and flexible to fit into anyone's pipeline, and just, I don't know. My general statement when I try to teach people, when they ask me like, oh, what should I use to get this type of texture? My answer is whatever works, whatever's fast. Effects is all about iteration. So the only thing that I would warn you about when you're considering how to go about doing something is don't do something slow. If you're going to do something slow, pick a fast solution first just to test it out and make sure you're onto something, or else you're going to waste a lot of time. I iterate hundreds, if not thousands of times on every single effect. And so if I actually take the time to slow down and implement, like go through Fume for every iteration, I'm screwed. So usually if I'm going to do a Fume sim, what I'll do is I'll try to shape out the effect just with static frames and just like hand-painted shapes, so I can sort of see the types of shapes that I want. And once I know what works and what doesn't, then I can go back to Fume and sort of recreate and go from there.
I think what I'd like to do is talk about where you see the future of effects, not only just in sort of the production, maybe the tools, the types of things that you foresee coming, types of things you'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. So broad.
Yes.
Give me more. Guide me.
Well, I mean, you know, you've got people that are going out into the industry, you know, every time we've got sort of a hardware bump, there's going to be some more stuff that we can kind of have access to.
Right.
So yeah, where do you see what do you see kind of the biggest changes in sort of the day-to-day?
Okay, sure. So right now I think I always view or I've come to, I should say, view the console lifespan as a pendulum. At the very beginning of the console's lifespan, there's a huge push for technical artists because none of the tools in the studio are capable of doing what you hope that they could do to take advantage of the new console. So right now there's a huge need for technical artists that can write shaders and help develop tools and stuff like that for particles. That's going to last, I'd say, probably another year, 2 years, depending on how well Unreal's Niagara comes out. If they do a strong enough job setting the new standard, then there's going to be a bigger need for just damn good artists to come in and use these tools and make good art. And that's actually the part that I'm really excited about. Like, I hate it when my tools and my tech gets in the way. Like, I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be super inspired to go make an effect, and then I get into work and I realize, oh, I can't do it. And that sucks. But I'm really, really excited for the industry to sort of get past the conversations and dependency on tech and just start using what we have to make really good art. What I mean by tech, if I'm describing that, is right now, not a lot of companies are paying enough attention or have the ability to pay enough attention to scene integration. Scene integration, just the word integration of effects, has been my catch-all basically for the past like 4 or 5 years, which means everything. Like, not only just getting the effect to sit well in the environment, so taking all of your lighting, taking the ambient tones, working with the global wind system, like integrating into all these things that all the rest of the systems and departments are working in, but also tying it into, again, the character interactions, the player interactions, telling the story of the world and the player's interactions with the world, etc. So tying all those things together, there's a lot of problems in there and not a lot of tools that are set up to solve it. So I think there's a big push for that across most companies. To be more specific, the old school way of doing footsteps, I'm going to walk around if I can. The old school way of doing footsteps is to have a walk cycle, so hey, walk cycle. And in the cycle, you kind of just, like, you look at it, and if he's walking on a flat ground, you say, oh, so his foot hits the ground on this frame, and you tag that frame of the animation, and then you play your effect there. But as soon as he's not walking on flat ground, that's horribly wrong. And so the new school of thought for how to do character interactions, things like that, is that they all need to be collision-based. So the foot would actually need to track and collide with the ground. So if he's walking uphill or downhill or whatever else, it's dynamically adjusting, and you're getting an accurate frame where that hit happens. If you want to take that even further, you need to make good art, if you think about a person walking in snow, there's one element that happens when he steps into the snow, and decal. So if we talk about the effects that would happen and the decal, and let's say it's like a soft powdery snow, so not sticky, not snowman type of snow. You're going to have a little bit of kick from your heel going into the ground, but not too much, just a tiny bit of snow and fluff flying around. You're going to have that first footprint. Then you're going to drag. So there's different elements where you're just making like a plowed trough. And then when you step out of the snow, your foot is working like a shovel, and you're going to kick a bunch of snow forward. Those would have to be, if we wanted to go into that much fidelity, those would have to be 3 different assets. But you would need to know when those 3 different things happen in the game dynamically. So when I say better tools basically to do interactions and integration, it's things like we need to consider and give the artist the ability to tie all that stuff together. Better shaders as well. A lot of Unreal is amazingly well set up with its material editor to give you access to all kinds of crazy solutions through shaders. That's kind of the same path, like I said earlier, that film took, where they just went smarter with their shaders to help them do a lot of the work for them. So I think most people are pushing things in that way. That does require someone to be fairly technical and understand shaders and stuff, but that's a lot of fun. And then finally, eventually, we are going to get to the point where we're doing a little more fluid interactions and volumetrics. Right now, we're starting to see vector fields in 3D, which is awesome. That's kind of the closest thing that I would say to that we have in our standard toolbox of tools for volumetrics and fluids. There's a couple companies that I've seen that actually have a dynamic grid vector field, so not just like a static one where it says at this point in space go that way and at this point in space go that way, but one that's actually doing a really coarse fluid simulation and changing directions based off of your volumetric densities, etc. So those are cool. Where we run into problems though is that unless I'm doing small points, I can't really apply that in any particular way. So there's still a bunch of gaps in the way we're using all of it, but
right.
I'm starting to see those, for wind across a level. So the entire level will have one dynamic grid vector field coarsely presented across it, and they're doing some bounding collisions with big buildings and stuff like that, so you actually get nice shaping and eddies and stuff around alleyways.
Oh, cool. So do you think that that there's going to be, that we're finding that there's more standards? Because to some degree we're getting to the point in the industry, on the art side of things, where we find some standards somewhat in lighting and some standards somewhat in materials, and so we're moving that way, and effects is still kind of teetering there, but moving to more of a standard to where it's sort of an understood way of how you might approach some of those things.
I'm seeing a lot of companies recognize that they need better effects tools, which is step one, getting a programmer to help build the tools. As soon as you cross that threshold, the very next step you're going to say is well, what is a better tool? And most people go to Unreal.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of times that I've been shot down by a programmer that said, no, that's not possible, and I say, I can do it in Unreal, which they hate, but it's a decent counter argument. If someone else has solved this problem that you just said is impossible, why is it actually impossible? And oftentimes it actually still is impossible because every engine is slightly different, but having that ability to push back and say, look, I can do this in Unreal as a point of conversation, they'll often say, well, I can't quite do that, but what is it exactly that you're trying to achieve? And I'll say, well, what I really want is just a way to do blah, 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 blah. And I'll say, okay, so I can't do it that way, but would this work? And that's, so we're still using Unreal as our baseline standard of discussion and jumping off from there.
Do you think that that will reach a point where there would be a standalone tool that is easily integratable into people's engines, or is it just too tied into the engine?
I'm fascinated by that conversation, actually. Most big AAA studios are really, really reluctant to use third-party tools. And with reason. A third-party tool is usually a black box that they can't touch, but we have to optimize so much that when there's this thing, let's say we plug in Scaleform.
Right.
So Scaleform by default used to take, I don't know what it is now, but used to take 3 milliseconds right off the top of our entire budget of 30 milliseconds. So just the act of using Scaleform, 3 milliseconds gone. And if we look at that and say, yeah, but I'm only using it for this one thing, so I bet I could optimize that, your business contract with Scaleform probably wouldn't allow, when they're still an independent company, probably wouldn't have allowed you to get into the source code to touch it. Right. So there's a huge reluctance to actually work with third-party tools. Particle tools seem to scare programmers the most because we kill frame rate way too easily. That said, I've seen a lot of really cool particle tools that are third parties. Like Popcorn Effects is remarkably powerful, super inefficient, but remarkably powerful. And so I do want to see a little bit more of the competition in our tool set, and because they're driving a lot of change in the industry. It's another point of comparison for me to go, yeah, but I can do it in Popcorn Effects. The problem right now is people always turn to Popcorn Effects and say like, yeah, but that's not in any games.
Right.
So I don't know. There's a huge push in indie studios, though, on the other hand, to, like, if you look at Unity, Unity has all kinds of particle plugins because it's an indie studio. They're trying to move fast. They're trying to be agile, and why not?
Right.
If it solves your problems, great, move on. So I think that there's a lot of intermediary ground. I'm not too sure. I think the AAA industry, we could go into a much longer conversation, but I do think the AAA industry in its current form is going to change drastically. Because of the standardization of engines like Unreal, because of the successes of small studios, et cetera. But
Cool. All right. Well, earlier we had a chance to talk to a bunch of students, or Keith did, really, out in the hallway, and we got all kinds of awesome stuff from you guys. So at this time, I want to go ahead and take a few minutes for questions from the audience. It might be a little bit longer than we're normally allotted for, but I think it would be more interesting.
yeah, I'll chat with you guys.
Yeah. Keith likes to talk to people. So there's mics, like one on each side, and if you raise your hand, they will come find you if they can see you.
Yes.
Do we have any?
I can't see anybody.
If you can please stand when you ask the question so they can see you. Thank you.
Does this mic work? Okay.
Hi.
So my question was, how much does the environmental artist need to know on the particle side? Should they know enough to help the particle artist to integrate into their environments, or should they just let the particle artist do all the work for them?
There's kind of two facets to that. I think there's a huge amount of benefit to everybody knowing a little bit about everything so that you can at least appreciate what other people are doing. And what that allows you to do is when you're in a production pipeline, there's just a series of dependencies. Effects is usually at the end, but like all of your work as an environment artist is going to depend on design and animation and all the people upstream of you. And when those designers change something, they need to be aware of the consequences of their actions for you. And similarly, you need to be aware of your consequences for the effects artist. So at a bare minimum, it warms my heart to no degree when the people in front of me in that production pipeline understand that their actions have consequences to me, and then they can come and tell me, oh, hey, I changed the timing of this animation, you're going to need to update this. Oh, awesome, I can do that. It's when they're unaware that I get blindsided and it just causes a big mess. If you can actually get yourself to the point where you are useful to the effects department, you are just adding so much value to you as an employee. So I would say certainly be aware of it, fiddle around with it. It's fun, try it out, see if it's something that you enjoy. If you're in a small company, people that are multifaceted like that have so much value because they need that. They need you to be able to wear multiple hats and just help make an amazing product with the resources that you have around you. In a bigger company, you might not be leaned on as much for that, but again, it's still a valuable thing. I mean, I would have, if I had any more bodies at any point in any of the crunches that I've worked on, I would have used it. So he certainly would have been helpful to me.
Cool. Good question.
Here. Is this? Oh, it is on. Okay, I have a question from one of our online viewers named Sydney. She's a computer animation major from Jacksonville, Florida. And her question is, as a computer animation major, what would be the best way to focus on getting a job or getting your foot in the door in this line of work?
Can I have a follow-up question? Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Okay.
It's fine by me.
Is she trying to get into games specifically, or are we just talking about effects?
There's a bit of a lag here, so I don't know if she'll be able to hear you for a minute or so, but I can certainly ask online. We'll go back to that.
Okay.
Say yes. We could say
let me try to answer both, I suppose. So the question was, what should you study to get into, let's just say, the broad scope of effects? If you're trying to get into film, again, it depends on how you want to apply yourself. The smaller studios need people that are very cross-disciplined. If you're going to be an effects artist in film, it helps to know effects tools and also have a really strong understanding of compositing. If you want to talk about art, what you should really be paying attention to is color theory, and animation timing, follow through, and like we share a lot of artistic values and integrity with animation and with concept art. Composition matters tremendously for effects, for both games and film.
About tools, maybe.
Yeah, with tools, if you're getting into film, I couldn't possibly recommend Houdini enough. Everybody in the industry is both terrified and fascinated by Houdini, which is a great opportunity for students because basically what's happening is everybody acknowledges that Houdini is amazing, but they're too afraid to use it. So if you can come in there and know Houdini, you're going to probably have a lot of opportunities. Again, there's a lot of great tools out there. Max has a ton of fantastic plugins for film effects like Krakatoa, Thinking Particles. Thinking Particles is fantastic. Fume effects is a very, very fast solution to types of problems. So if you want to just make fast art, it's widely used. And again, Houdini, Maya Fluids, like there's tools, RealFlow, there's tools for all the different challenges. So you kind of have to pick where you want to apply yourself. If you want to go to a big film studio, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to spend a lot of your time on one shot. Like we're talking months making one shot just freaking fantastic because they have the time for that. If you want to go to a smaller production studio, let's say Blur or Method, some of the Method smaller studios, or Coley Effects, whatever, like you're going to spend a lot of time doing a lot of different projects. I've hired a lot of people from Blur, and I love it because what happens is they'll have 1 week to turn around an entire shot. And so basically the way it's described to me is we get one try to do it the way we want to, and then we scramble like crazy. So if that one try doesn't work, then you start finding the next faster solution and then the next faster solution. And by the end of it, like you've got to find something, whether it was what you wanted or not. And it means that they have to think on their feet. They have to be very aware, and not necessarily super knowledgeable, but very aware of all the different options at their disposal, and they have to move fast. That's where the compositing side comes in. So all that's for film. If we want to talk about games, because we're chasing film, a lot of the prerequisite knowledge is very, very similar. I love people that know Houdini and Fume Effects and have those concepts of how to make really good art using all those tools because it's still useful. But then the next thing you have to show me is that you actually want to work within the system in games, that you want to work with the limitations, and that you understand the puzzles of what we're actually dealing with. Like by showing me the beautiful film effects, you're showing me art. Now, can you handle the really shitty tools we deal with? That's the next challenge. I've had bad experiences hiring some film people because they'll come in basically with this ego like, oh, games have really bad effects. I'm from film, I know better, like I'm going to teach all of you guys. And then they struggle because they can't use our tools to make the art that they're used to. So either they get pissed off or we get pissed off at them. The end result is that it doesn't work out. The few people that I've hired from film that have been amazing and like super interested in applying their skill set to games have been the best damn employees I've ever seen. And they're actually making huge changes in the industry because of their wide, diverse skill set and their ability to tie that all together into what we're trying to tackle. Like they're bringing solutions that I've never thought of before.
Cool. We got anything on this side? Yep.
Okay, so I just kind of wanted to ask, like, in my experience playing games, often what'll happen is it'll be something really nicely put together with like really good graphics and everything. But I'll find like a bad effect that maybe like I'm backtracking or something and I wasn't necessarily supposed to come across it, or it's right there in front of me. But one bad effect in a game with really good effects tends to like spoil the broth for me and take me right out of the game and the story altogether. So I kind of have like a two-tiered question.
Yeah.
One, do you think it's better to have consistent but maybe not as good effects, or to try and just show the best effects right up front? And where's like your limit with what you're willing to let yourself get away with in that area?
Yeah, I mean, so I view that as a concept of integration. What is the intention of the game? To me, the intention of the game is to allow the player to have one cohesive experience that's all enveloping, not for me to show off my badass effect. So I'm definitely of the opinion that I would rather studios not use pre-rendered emissive flipbooks if they can't match that quality with everything. Like that's a huge concept of integration to me, is that everything needs to fit in the same world. If you took if you were doing a really bad Photoshop job and you took two images of Chad and tried to make him look like there's multiples of him in one room, if you don't integrate each of those instances of Chad into the same lighting, same light direction, same ambient tones, same specularity on his skin, like all of those things are going to make it the equivalent of a really bad Photoshop job. To me, that exact same concept applies to effects, but not a lot of people are following that. So I totally agree with you that there are a lot of games right now that have a really wide diversity of effects. I don't want to list any because I'm going to get in trouble for it, but I think that when you spend too much time on one particular type of effect or one technique, with this new console generation, a lot of people are thinking, oh, sweet, I can use flipbooks and just pre-render and play back a video. And they pull it off in this one scenario, and holy shit, that was awesome. That's like really, really impactful. But then I look a little bit to the right, and here's a really bad-looking fire. It pulls me right out of it too, because now I've got dissonance between the two types of art. And instead of being involved in the story, in the gaming experience, I think, wait, that's what's going on there. And all of a sudden, now I'm looking at it as a player again, thinking, what happened here? There's obviously a lot of variability with production timelines. I mean, I can spend 6 months polishing an effect, but then run out of time in the last 5 days and have to make like 100 effects in 5 days. So I'm going to get natural differences in quality there, unfortunately. That's just a byproduct of bad production planning that naturally happens. Your first point about sometimes backtracking, things like that, there's a lot of assumptions that we want to make as game developers about the way the player is going to play it. It's kind of up to the designers to help influence the player to play the game that way. Naughty Dog's games are very, very explicitly intended to be played in one way. If you don't play it, it ends up being a bad game, and you'll actually break the hell out of all of our art, because we built all the art, we optimized everything around the assumption that this experience is going to be played in something similar to this. It's an assumption that we had to use because if I don't get rid of everything behind you, I can't do as much directly in front of you. Like there's a lot of optimizations and advancements happening around those assumptions, but a lot of times they're bad assumptions and they can easily be broken. So that's the other byproduct, I think.
Cool. That's a good question.
Okay, we have another online question from Yodi. He's a game design bachelor's student from St. Petersburg. He has a two-part question. It is, for a smaller independent studio, how much do you think effects can or should be a priority? And how can a smaller studio use them to best effect? Maybe to their best effect.
Sure. The question about priority, it's a tough one even in AAA. I mean, so in studios that don't have a dedicated effects programmer, or even if they do, the question of, is an effect text system higher priority than something else? It's a really hard question, and the truth is that as an effects artist, most of the time, it's not. Like if the game isn't running smoothly, if the character isn't animating correctly, like these are all things that are more of the core cake. My effects are the frosting, and if the cake sucks, my frosting's not really going to do much. We always use the phrase like, you can't polish shit. And so I tend to find like effects are truthfully a frosting. They're the sprinkles on top. So you kind of have to work with the overall production and goal of that production to prioritize how much effort you want to put into it. At Naughty Dog, we felt like integrating the character into that world and also using that integration as a way to help drive the mood was really, really important for what we're striving for, and so we did prioritize it. It's been only recently that I'm seeing a lot of other studios recognize and acknowledge that their effects tools are bad and that they need to spend some time and money on it. So that's in the concept of big studios. When you start to apply that to smaller indie studios, you really have to decide how important are your effects for the game. So if you have a game like Geometry Wars, I'd say your effects are pretty damn important. But most games, the effects are not really that tied to the core crux of the game. They're oftentimes going to emphasize the feeling of a game, so maybe it's going to help really, really sell the look of the art and bring about a lot of the warmth and sort of charisma, if you will, of the game. So maybe it is important for that, but it's ultimately got to be a question of what are the key pillars of your game that your game is standing on, and are effects an integral part of that? If they're not, then you guys, by all means, should be taking as many shortcuts as you can that's not going to produce shit that pulls me out of the rest of the game. We have a funny saying in effects that we're not striving for good, we're striving for not bad. Again, because my effects aren't supposed to be the focus. They're supposed to be there, but the focus should be the intent of the level or the intent of the game at that point. So if plugins and if shortcuts and if pre-purchasing, like Unity has asset stores and Unreal is starting to develop a better asset store, if those give you guys shortcuts to get to that end goal of making an amazing game without distracting the player, then yeah, heck yeah, go for it.
So earlier you brought up that you have a specific way that you guys like to play your games, and you also brought up dynamic effects like the bloody handprints and snow. Do things like that work in more open world adventure games, like where the player kind of drives where they go?
Yeah, those are almost two conflicting ideas, I suppose. Two different schools of thought. The dynamic concept is one that really comes from the needs of an open world game where the player can do anything and you need to build a system that handles all of it appropriately. Most of the sections of Naughty Dog we possibly could have actually scripted. So, for example, I brought up the handprint in The Last of Us. There's one level where Joel is wounded, and so he's got a bloody hand and he's stumbling around through a hospital. And everywhere that he stumbles, he puts a handprint on the wall. Those were all scripted animations, and so we had the choice when we started that task of we could go through here and just hook up all these handprints on the animations, but we had this splashes system, so we went ahead and used it. The cool thing about going that route is that now anywhere that we want to add those interactions when the player is not scripted, when you're just running around and you can spend hours just running circles if you wanted to, we could still handle that. I think that those smarter systems are better for a lot of reasons. First of all, they require less work. You don't have to go through and tag every single frame of an animation. Like it's automatic, and so it's systemic. So like you do it once, and if you do it once well, it happens everywhere in the game, and that's a beautiful thing. Yeah, did that actually answer your question?
For the most part, I was just wondering if it was able to set up something that complex on collision and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of open world games already have to have those types of concepts. Maybe not necessarily that thorough, but if you take, like, if you're driving around a car in Grand Theft Auto and you pay attention to the surfaces that each of the four wheels are going to hit, they're already doing something like that. They also have like traction and slide mechanics that you can play different effects. So there's a lot of systemic systems like that. It's just not typically applied to the locomotion of the character that well or to that degree of fidelity. But they're growing. Open world games, I think, are the biggest pushing factor of most of those concepts because you just, like, there's zero ability to script. There's no other solution. If you want that fidelity, you have to come up with some sort of systemic way. The Witcher was actually fantastic because it did a lot of really unique solutions with interactions with plants and things like that. Yeah, open world games always, like, if you sit down and think about their systems and what it would take to cover all the different bases of potential, it's pretty insane.
I have a question about the PBR workflow.
Yeah.
Articles. I was wondering if you use programs like Substance Designer to make animated materials that are parameterized that you bring in, or do you just mainly work with texture patches?
So I tend to build that concept of like a parameterized motion directly in my shader. So in very similar ways that Substance actually works, where you're like animating noise and calculating a neural map off it, I can do all that directly in my particle shader, which then allows me to control all those different values during the lifespan of the particle based off of maybe the lifespan based off of character interactions or design or blueprint, whatever. So I suppose in the short answer, yes, but it's applied slightly differently. There's so many things you can do and so many cool tricks you can do directly in the shader that Substance actually was kind of built out of a lot of those concepts. Obviously applied to much better use in environments and actual textures. I do use Substance quite a bit for, to be honest, it's fantastic for generating those noises that I use in my shader. So I open it up all the time and just spit out like hundreds of noise maps and just throw random ones into my effects and see what works. Sure.
Given the fact that you know what effects goes where, what kind of influence do you have that necessarily a scene may not have, but you want to put in there that may convey the emotion going on in that scene?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Sorry, can you just say that one more time for me?
So basically, so say if a scene doesn't have an effect that you necessarily know should go in there, how much of an influence do you have on putting that effect?
Oh, I see. And unless the level's locked off or something like that, I can do it. Unless there's an art director or somebody saying no, absolutely not. I mean, it's a little bit different depending on the studio you go to. There's different politics in every studio and different team processes. Naughty Dog was a very, very, very team-oriented company, meaning that I could go and shout at the boss if, like, anyone, the game director, I could go and say like, hey, this is a really dumb idea. Can we do this instead? And so long as I can justify my opinion, we'll have it out, and then eventually someone will win. Similarly, like anybody could come to me and say, hey, Keith, that was really bad. I think you should keep working. I had, as a really quick side note, I had done one task and I was totally done with it. I was happy, and I'd moved on, but it was for a deadline that was coming up. And so Evan Wells, the president of Naughty Dog, came by and was kind of looking over my shoulder and saw that effect that I'd moved on since. And he was like, hey, so you're still working on that, right? And I looked at him and was like, yeah, I guess so. What's up? To actually answer your question, though, yeah, like if I saw anything in the game that I thought could be better, we would spend the time on it. More often than not, because I'm last in the production pipeline, like I have to move so fast that I don't have a ton of time to really think through what should be happening. So I loved to go around and like, if Chad were an environment artist and I knew that he was done working, the very first person that I would go to and sit down with and just say like, hey, what should happen in this level would be Chad. He's been sitting there staring at it with environment art for all this time. Like he built the environment. He knows exactly what he wants in his mind. And so I'll go to them to get inspiration. I'll talk to the designers, see like, hey, what do you envision here? I'll talk to the art director if we need to have that many conversations just to get inspiration, because I'm going to get so many good ideas. Otherwise, if it's just me, like I'm adding dust motes everywhere just so there's something so I can keep moving on. If I do have the time to think through an environment, then yeah, I love it. I love to sit down and like one of my favorite things to do is to be handed just a finished environment that I know isn't going to change anymore and just go to town on it for like a week. Because I'm just set dressing at that point, and I can spend the time to go in and add cool details and really make something that's impressive. Or hopefully it's impressive.
Okay, we have another online question from Spencer in the game design program.
Hi, Spencer.
How does Unity 3D compare to Unreal, in your opinion?
For effects, it's not... Should we just talk about effects or go broader, right? That's such a broad conversation. Unreal's... You kind of have to think through where their baseline, like where the two engines came from. Unreal came from a AAA engine and has gone public, and so its focus, like its base, was to be able to do really nice rendered scenes of a particular style, of the epic style. Its effects kind of had to fit in with that. So it has it's old. I actually really hate Cascade. It's like a 15-year-old Excel spreadsheet that won't die, but it's still there. And it works. Like you can get pretty amazing things. There's still loads of games with really, really nice effects shipping on it using the stock Epic tools. Unity doesn't have very good particle tools. It has a lot of really cool plugins that solve different problems here and there, but Unity is a tool that was built out of the indie scene, built almost to be open source, still commercialized, but so you end up with a lot of really modular things and tons of community-based solutions for your needs. So depending on the types of effects that you have and want, you'd have to go and find a plugin, and then there's different pros and cons to each of the plugins. I've never used Unity commercially. I've dabbled, so I can't really dig in too much, but I know that I think Shuriken is still like the most widely used particle tool in Unity, right?
The one that's built in?
Is Shuriken their built-in tool?
Yeah, no, probably. That's probably a plugin. I don't know enough about it, too. I've just only dabbled as well, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So dabbling and stuff. But I know that their effects system is very, very plugin oriented. And the cool thing about that is that if you're an indie developer, you have loads of options around your needs. So you can, if you need really simple effects, you don't need a super robust and expensive tool set, not just in cost, but also expensive in like GPU performance. There's plugins out there that are remarkably cheap to run at real time, but limited as the side effect of that cost.
Thank you. We have another question online, another quick one, from Dong Wook in the game art program. He says, what do you think about differences between movie and video games on VFX?
So like I said earlier, I think we're about 10 years behind. I think that more of us in real time should be looking to film as reference and inspiration. The film effects industries hit this fascinating point where they're no longer just focusing on making realistic effect. Like I feel like we've had this era of films that was just like effects porn, and I feel like right now we're kind of crossing that, and I'm starting to see a lot of people use effects really artistically well. Like I'm actually really enjoying a lot of the effects in superhero films where they're doing such a good job adding macro and micro detail and motions that at a quick glance you see this gorgeous shaped, like really, really nice silhouetted effect with beautiful colors, and it's comped in well. And then when you look a little bit further and start to dig in, there's still a ton of really cool detail and motion stuff going and like swirling going on inside of it. Obviously those are superpowers, so you have a ton of artistic liberties, but the fact that they're making those so captivating, like I'm really, really enjoying watching that, and I want to see a lot of people taking those concepts and applying those to games, because it's still, that is just art. It's just your sense of timing and detail and composition. So I don't know, I tend to see them both in that way. Like our final art product is still the same. I guess if I describe it to people that don't know anything about 3D, so pardon the really simplistic analogy here, I equate film effects versus game effects to like sculpting a bust versus painting a bust. You're still striving for a realistic looking bust. You still need to know anatomy and composition, color theory, and everything else. It's just your medium has changed and your limitations have changed. So by that measure, I view them as almost the same. It's just I can't do what they're doing because they're the better half, I suppose.
So my question was, as you said earlier, the difference between an environment artist placing effects versus a VFX artist placing effects. Is there anything being last in the pipeline that you would want environment artists to know that would kind of like optimize the scene for you when it gets down to you?
I think it's just important that you would know, again, the consequences of your changes. So like if you've got a burning object, and you decide to move around that object or change it into stone. You know, like let's say it was a wooden crate and now all of a sudden it's a metal barrel. The metal barrel probably shouldn't be burning anymore, right? Like really simple things like that come up all the time. I have a company right now that I'm working with that their designers decided that they want dynamic procedural forest fires, which is just like, holy hell, that would be the biggest task I've ever seen. The only game that I've ever seen do dynamic burning disbursement in AAA would be Far Cry, and they spent years on this tech that still doesn't look that great. And what they wanted is this like insanely art-directed forest fire that happens procedurally around the player and at random times. And it's like that isn't going to work unless you spend a lot of money on it. And it's really just thinking through those things. Like, I guess the best way that I could answer your question is if while you're making environment art, think like an effects artist. Like, what would you have to do to justify this effect? And actually think it through in real life. A lot of people, even water, water's a funny one because very few people actually think through all the different consequences of water. It's not just that waterfall, it's that now all of a sudden there needs to be water running down surfaces that are moist, collecting all that mist, and then there needs to be mist, there needs to be wet surfaces, there needs to be character interactions. What happens when the character walks out? Is he wet? Are his feet leaving wet footprints, which is a damn near impossible problem to solve as well, because what does this carpet look like wet versus the stone outside versus wood? Like, those are all different applications of wetness that like would have to be a per material solution. So usually when I run into issues, it's just that the people in front of me were just stuck in their own little world, focusing on their job, which is great, you know, and that's what they should be doing, but they weren't quite thinking through the rest of it. Audio usually has a bigger problem with this. I would say audio is definitely the most screwed over department in any game production. The example that I always give, I'm going to dumb it down a little bit, just make it faster and less, more PC, but the audio director of one of the games I worked on was standing on the balcony one time when I went out to just take a break, and he was shouting at one of the designers, and he told the designer to close his eyes and asked him, "What do you hear?" The designer's like, "Oh, well, I hear the traffic, the street noise." Oh, no, sorry, I already ruined the story. He said, "Look around and tell me what you hear." And so he said, "Well, I hear the traffic, the street noise, there's a breeze, I hear some leaves rustling, I hear some birds chirping, blah, 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 blah." And then he said, "Okay, now turn around and close your eyes." And he said, "Okay, now what do you hear?" And he's like, "Well, I hear the street noise." And he's like, "Exactly, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there." And so what happens in games is the designers always go through and they visually optimize out everything you can't see. But then, like, if you have a plane flying over your head, if you delete the plane, the audio guys have nothing to hook up their sound to anymore. But the plane's gone, so then they have to go through and spend this insane amount of time hand animating an additional like sound emitter that's running through the level like as if it's receding, as opposed to just letting the plane go. And there's some cost expenses to both of those, but like it's just those consequences of how every single person has to do their job are usually not thought out or not even considered by everyone else in front of them.
I have another online question from Zachary in game design. He says, looking back, is there anything you could have done to better prepare yourself for your career?
Yeah, tons and tons and tons of things. I was pretty young when I came to Full Sail, and I think that there's a fair amount of like well-rounding and weathering from the world weary that happens as you become an adult. So I was young and naive. I wasn't prepared for how many times I failed professionally. Like you kind of romanticize the notion of like I'm going to fail all the time and learn from it, but when you actually do that in practice, it gets really depressing. Especially as a student, I came here and I thought that the first time I do something, it had to be a masterpiece. And so I spent a lot of time like just thinking through everything instead of like just buckling down and doing it. Now I recognize that the only way I'm ever going to get to good art is if I do it over and over and over again. So if I make an effect, instead of sitting down and spending like 6 days thinking through how I'm going to make the effect, if I just sit down and make something in 10 minutes and then delete it and make it again, learning from what I had just done, I'm going to have a way better effect by the end of that process and probably a quarter of the time. So, I mean, the best advice that I can give to you guys is like allow yourselves to fail safely. It's such an integral part of any art, of effects. It's super important. I usually have no idea how I'm going to solve something when I start a task, and the only way that I'm going to get to that answer is just to fail over and over again. So the faster I can iterate, the faster I'm going to get to an actual workable solution. And that doesn't mean that I'm doing a bad job. I mean, there's definitely a depressing low in some of those times where like you just can't find the solution that works. But me sitting there pondering over it isn't going to get me there any faster. I just have to keep trying. So I just throw everything at the wall. What else? I suppose getting a job sounds really scary. It is really scary. It's really terrifying because all of a sudden it's very personal and it's all on you. But it's kind of a probability thing. Like most things in life, I guess everything's a bit of a gamble, and the more things you can do to increase your odds, the better off you are. So what I mean by that is like apply to loads of places, get yourself online, talk in communities, meet people. Like every individual thing that you can think of to increase your odds, it's more likely that your number's going to come up. It's all really just complete blind luck. And so I don't know. I suppose as the great philosopher Wayne Gretzky once said, 100% of the shots you don't take don't go in.
Online question from Cassandra. She says, hey, Keith, have you ever used Maya containers and effects as a final product in a film or video game?
You can't really use Maya containers as a final product in a game because it has to come through the game's particle engine. I've definitely used them to create assets that I've put into the game particle system. So yeah, absolutely. I think Maya's doing a decent-ish, at best, job, I'll say, for their effects tools to keep up. There's definitely some elements in Maya that are fantastic and will get you amazing results. I think Maya fluids are fairly outdated at this point, so I would be surprised if people were using just raw Maya fluids for final outputs in films. There's either faster solutions if you're on a short timeline at one of those small studios, or if you're at a big studio, you're probably going to have your own proprietary tools written in Maya that are better versions of what Maya offers. The language of Maya fluids, though, is pretty standard. So it's one of those scenarios where like you wouldn't be doing harm by learning how they work, learning the pros and cons of them, and starting to understand. Like it is a very good entry into understanding how volumetrics work, and then taking that and using other tools or kind of running with it. I hope that answered the question.
Any more questions from the room?
No.
We do have another one online.
Sure.
Okay, yes, one more.
How are we doing on time?
We have lots of online questions. It's a great group online.
Awesome, I like it.
This question is from Aaron from Atlanta, Georgia, a game art major. How and where did you find your passion in visual effects?
Let's see. So my passion started ultimately as the puzzle. I was teaching here at Full Sail. I was teaching film effects, and I had a student ask me how game effects work. And I didn't know. I had no idea. And so I went home, because I was kind of intrigued. I went home and I downloaded Unreal 2 at the time in the Quake engine, and I just started dabbling, and I started realizing that I really, really enjoy it. There's no wait time. In film effects, those of you guys that have used film tools, you spend a lot of time like, oh, my viscosity needs to go up 0.01. hit sim and wait 5 hours. Oh, that didn't work. Like it's a very different experience than workflow, whereas game effects, because your iteration is hopefully near immediate, it becomes a lot more artistic, and it's all more about the puzzle of how I'm going to use my tools to achieve something. So I was initially attracted by the puzzle, and then also because it was so easy to get a job. So I landed my first job. I was like, wow, this is great. I'm working. And started realizing again that I really enjoy the production experience. It wasn't really until I got to Naughty Dog and I had the chance to meet Amy Hennig, who fortunately I'm still blown away, is going to be introducing me on Friday. Bruce Straley, and like some of these other big figureheads in the industry that are pushing the notion of what the game medium is really about. And this is also around the time that our tools and our tech and the hardware is getting to the point now where games can actually almost be art. There's some games out there that actually are capable of conveying really complex emotions to me, and I love that. I've always been attracted to storytelling and anything that can make me cry or laugh or be afraid. Like that's amazing, and games are starting to be able to achieve that. And it wasn't really until I sat down and had the opportunity to just listen to Amy and Bruce and some of these other people that are really pushing the potential of the medium that I started to really appreciate what effects and what my particular skill set can apply to that, and to really understand and like just hope and want to push for that so badly. So I think that's kind of where my passion ultimately came from. I mean, Amy's one of those people that every single time I've had the chance to sit down and talk with her about games and about what usually the work we're trying to do, I sit back and I think, God, I want to work on that. And like that's a really inspiring feeling when you're having something described to you, and you just think like, man, that's amazing. I want to help that. Like I so badly want that. I agree. And that's kind of where I think my entire career and passion really kicked off for me personally. I don't bite, I promise.
More online.
Yes, we have some great questions online. So this one is from Tyler, and his question is, do you have any advice for game writers in relation to visual effects?
Ooh. Yeah. Game writers is it's a fairly new phrase to take seriously. Most of the time in history, the game writers, a few outstanding ones certainly, but most of the time it was like almost an afterthought. It was the designers. If you guys ever want a really like depressing laugh when you are working at a game studio, go and just sit in on the designer conversations about in-game character dialogue. Like the NPCs saying like, there he is, all that. They're so poorly thought out. And so it's only been recently that most game companies are really acknowledging that they should have a writer in-house really focusing on what the story of this game is. They should be thinking through the story actually before they make the levels, instead of trying to weave a story randomly through their levels. And putting writing in its place that film always has it, where like the writing is the core crux of the presentation. So that's still kind of a new novel idea. Again, a lot of studios are starting to approach that. With The Last of Us, this amazing thing happened where, again, because Bruce and Neil were writing it together, and they're both remarkably talented visual presenters as well, designers and artists, they were actually thinking through what the art is supposed to feel like while they were writing the story. And so the notes that we actually got along with the story were like time of day, sky descriptions, overcast weather, somber and depressing, which like in those 3 or 4 sentences tells me so much about what I'm striving for now in this level. And that would like, and obviously you can immediately imagine that when you're reading the story, and you can just picture the way the entire thing is supposed to go. So I wasn't reading a drab script. I was actually reading like a fairly described novel that worked so well because everybody in the studio that read that was on the same page about where the art was supposed to go and like what the purpose of all this was. One of the other big problems that I see, this is a slight side rail, one of the big problems that I see when I move to a lot of different studios is that the art team doesn't know what the design team is doing, and the design team doesn't know what the animation team is doing. And a lot of that does come down from the messaging at the top, basically, where either that information isn't being shared correctly, interdepartment communication isn't happening, but like, imagine if all of you, let's say 6 or 7 of you guys at a time got together to work on a project, and you said, hey, I'm going to be the animator, I'll do the modeling, whatever, and then you guys got just a drab script that says, like, at this frame this happens, and at this frame this happens, and that's it. you're all going to kind of go off and do something very segmented. But if instead that pitch describes what the overall experience is supposed to be like, all of a sudden now you're all going to be honing in your focuses on that one experience and shaping that one experience. So I guess to tie that back to the initial question, the more that the writing can help convey what the writing is supposed to mean to everybody else, the better off. And that again includes sound. Should never forget about sound.
And then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Cool.
I'm sorry.
You were saying how someone coming from film and going into games, and it could be a struggle. What about if someone was working like visual effects in games and wanted to go into film? How would that be? Would it be easier or harder?
Opposite struggle. I guess to further define that struggle, it's difficult because our tools are so limiting. So if you were once making this amazing, gorgeous artwork, and you jump over to games, you've kind of set your ego as if you could make that gorgeous artwork again, but now you can't, and so it can be really frustrating and depressing. Also, just totally different sets of challenges. So if you make that transition before you really appreciate it, you're going to run into a lot of surprises and frustrations. I've definitely had success stories where I've had some people that worked in film that were just fascinated by tools, and they were like working in Unreal on their own and just really wanted to deal with that puzzle and had already personally embraced the new challenges, and they were amazing employees. Going the opposite way, I would definitely have a hard time jumping back over to film because now my focus is everything that I think about from day to day when I'm making these effects is gone, and all that I need to worry about is how this looks from one lock perspective using state-of-the-art tools. I would become a different type of artist because I'm just not used to thinking in things in that way. That's not to say that I couldn't do it, but what I would expect is that I would have a long warm-up time to learn the tools correctly and to become a competitive level artist. I would be fine in production environments. I might not be fine in some of the politics of a film production studio because it's totally different. But so it's going to be the opposite struggle effectively. Like I'm used to making crappy art that is better than every other crappy art. Now I have to make the best art possible. How's that for a summary of my job?
Cool. All right, I want to thank you guys for coming out and attending. I want to thank the online people as well, which some really great questions and great questions from you guys. And obviously, especially thank our guest, Keith Guerrette, for the knowledge, information. All right, so that's it. Have a great day, guys.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll just listen really quickly, if you can help us turn the room around by tucking in your chairs, make sure you have all of your belongings. Also, Keith is going to have a meet and greet this afternoon at 4 o'clock in 3F 115C. So for those of you who would like to have some more one-on-one time with him, you can meet him there.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too, man.